A momentous moment. If you are terminally ill, should you have the right to get help to end your life? This week, Parliament will decide. And what's wrong with British workers? Why are record numbers of people off sick? And as danger rises in Ukraine, France tells us there are no red lines.
Each time the Russian army progresses by 1 square kilometer, the threat gets 1 square kilometer closer to Europe.
And morning, and apologies for a technical difficulty there as we were coming on air. But here in the studio, we're pleased to be joined by Liz Kendall, the Welfare Secretary, and Kevin Hollinrake, the Shadow Housing Secretary for the Conservatives. And my team at the desk throughout the next 60 minutes is Nadine Dorries, author, former Conservative Cabinet Minister, broadcaster and journalist Piers Morgan, and historian and journalist Jonathan Dimbleby. Great to have the three of you with us. And all three of them have their own personal experiences that have shaped their views on assisted dying, which we will talk about at some length today, because we know many people watching at home and around the country are so strongly interested in what will happen this week. But before we get to that, let's see what's making the news this morning. And assisted dying and welfare do dominate the headlines. The Observer reports the Justice Secretary describing assisted dying as a state death service. But the Sunday Times splashes with a poll claiming public support for the bill. Keir Starmer has promised the Mail on Sunday a crackdown on what he calls the bulging benefits bill blighting society. And the Sunday Telegraph and the Express both carry warnings about the threat from Russia. But while you were sleeping, as the BBC is reporting, a deal was reached at the COP29 climate summit in Baku. $300 billion to help with the costs of climate change, after what feels like familiar late-night drama over whether a deal could actually be done. Jonathan, I know you take a keen interest in environmental issues. You have done for a long time. Do you think the COP process is still credible?
Yes, it's better than nothing. I was at the first of the climate conferences in 1991 in Rio. The next one's going to be there. We've come a long way. It's not far enough. Despite the commitment of the $300 billion, despite all the other actions that are being taken, of course, Trump is a problem on the side. We do not know what he will do. We know that China is moving. Despite all that, the evidence is overwhelming that we're creeping further and further, almost ineluctably, towards a crisis that will dwarf all other crises we've ever experienced.
And yet when it comes to the politics, Nadine, I mean, during your time in government, this was very often seemed to be at the top of the agenda, but it's gone out of fashion, hasn't it, in this country at least? Why has that happened?
I don't know, because we're not in government anymore. But what I will say, though, is it's worrying because the economic growth in this country is going to come from technology, and much of that technology is centred around the green industries, where there are many jobs to be created and improvements to be made. So, you know, this COP was very much like COP26, which I attended as a minister, which was all in the final hour, all at the last minute, and as we were saying just before, all the drama that comes overnight. But let's not let that detract from what is the serious issue about what was happening. Don't think it's enough money, certainly not enough money to those poorer countries. We saw what happened in Spain, here in Europe, just weeks ago. Climate change is real. But I think the answer is because we realise and we accept that some of these changes may need to happen not as fast as we thought they could, because we don't want the cost to be borne by individuals. That maybe it's slipping down the agenda.
And hard to have this debate in a cost of living crisis when many people have been watching their pennies. Piers, we know that you're one of the people in this country who's got good connections with Donald Trump. What do you think he'll do about this agenda once he's back in the White House?
Well, I mean, I would call it cop out, as I have done the other 28, because I just don't think it ever probably has the landing impact it ought to have. But I do think the most crucial person may not be Donald Trump, but it might be his best buddy right now, Elon Musk, who is rapidly emerging as one of the most transformative and powerful people on the planet in different spheres, whether it's SpaceX or Neuralink, or in particular, of course, electric cars. You know, he believes in climate change. He thinks it's real. He's there right next to Trump now, morning, noon and night, dictating pretty much everything that Trump seems to be doing. And I think he's going to become a pivotal figure. Trump's view, I've spoken to him about this, is that you've got to bring the people with you. And that if you're just putting a sledgehammer down and say no more fossil fuels, it actually, A, it will be ruinous to an economy that does that, which it would be. But second, you don't bring people with you. It's like anything. When you smash people over the head and tell them you've got to do something, they don't do it. So I think it's got to be done in stages, probably not as fast as Jonathan would like. But actually, if you bring the people with you, in the end, I think they will come.
OK, well, we'll be back with you three a bit later in the programme. But it's a big week ahead of us in this country, not just because of the vote on assisted dying, but also we will see in black and white how the government wants to tackle a problem that has grown astonishingly in recent years. Just take a look at this. The number of working age people on health-related benefits stands at 4.2 million. That's increased by 1 million since 2019. The number who are not working due to long-term sickness has risen since the pandemic. It's now at nearly 2.8 million. And the bill for taxpayers for health-related benefits is currently £60 billion more than, and it's forecast to rise to 100 billion a year by the end of the decade. Well, Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, is with us this morning. It's great to have you with us. As we've just shown people, not just the costs, but the increases are absolutely jaw-dropping. Why do you think this has happened?
I think there are a complex number of reasons. We know we are an older, sicker nation. Life expectancy and healthy life expectancy had halted even before the pandemic. We are seeing a really worrying number of young people now out of work, not in education, training or employment, often driven by mental health problems, but also made worse if they lack basic skills, maths and English GCSE. And many of these problems are concentrated in parts of the country that were decimated in the 80s and 90s, that the last government promised but failed to level up. So there are real problems in certain parts of the country. And what we intend to do is to get Britain working again. This is about increasing people's opportunities to work and get on at work with more better paid jobs in every part of the country. But it's also about understanding this fundamental issue. A healthy nation and a healthy economy are two sides of the same coin. And the problem at the moment is that our employment support system and welfare system is not set up to deal with that problem. It's too much focused on official unemployment figures. Those need to be kept low, but we've got to solve this conundrum of poor health, poor work and not enough people being able to earn to build a better life.
And I know you've studied this for a long time, both in opposition and now in government, but there are 1 million more people claiming health-related benefits. Do you really, in your bones, think that there are 1 million more people in this country who are not capable of work than there were a few short years ago?
I think there are a combination of factors here. I do think we are seeing an increase in the number of people with mental health problems, both self-diagnosed. I think it's good that stigma has been reduced, but also diagnosed by doctors. We are also seeing more people in their 50s and above, often women with bad knees, hips, joints. We've got a real problem with our health service, with people waiting a long time for treatment.
But on that issue of mental health that you raised there, and you say sometimes it's self-diagnosis, if you look at the increase in rates, especially with young people who are not either going to college or working because of mental health issues, do you think we might have over-medicalised what essentially can be normal feelings? You know, people now often say they have anxiety. But have we gone too far in this? And actually, life is hard. Sometimes you might feel bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't work.
I genuinely believe that there's not one simple thing. You know, the last government said people were too bluesy to work. I mean, I don't know who they were speaking to. There is a genuine problem with mental health in this country. And if you look at the best evidence, there is an increase. People are much more anxious. I think the cost of living crisis, anxious parents, anxious children, the impact of social media. But I think what we need, you've seen, and actually a doubling of the number of young people who are not in education, employment or training saying that they have a mental health problem. So what do we need to do to tackle this problem? Number one, shift the focus to preventing it happening in the first place with more mental health support in the community and in people's homes. We are going to be bringing forward a new youth guarantee so that every young person is earning on learning overhauling the apprenticeship system so more people have a chance to train, and bringing together that work, health and skills support, really driven by people in local areas, because that's what our young people deserve.
But if young people will not take up those offers, will they face sanctions? Will they lose benefits if they just say no? Because you've said yourself should be no option of people having a life on benefits.
Yes, and the reason this is so important is we will transform those opportunities for young people. We will put in place a youth guarantee so everyone has the chance to be earning or learning. But in return for those new opportunities, young people will have a responsibility to take them up. And let me tell you why. Because if you lack basic skills in today's world, that is brutal. If you are out of work when you're young, that can have lifelong consequences in terms of your future job prospects and earning potential. And it is also bad for your health. So we, the government, we will face up to our responsibility, unlike the last government, of having that guarantee in place. But young people in return will have that responsibility to take it up. And you know what? The young people I meet are desperate for a chance.
But
they're desperate for a chance to get skills. They're desperate for a chance to earn a lurk. We'll fulfil our responsibilities and make that side of the bargain.
But as the Welfare Secretary, do you believe, as the last Labour government did, that there are people who can work who won't work?
Yes,
That's a phrase that one of your predecessors as a new Labour minister used. Do you believe that?
Yes, and I know from speaking to our job coaches, our fantastic job coaches in job centres, that there are people who could work who aren't. But I think they are in the minority. The young people that I speak to, I went to my Tesco's in my constituency in Beaumont Leys the other week. Young people really struggling with anxiety and depression, getting support from Tesco's and the King's Trust to get the skills and training they need, to get those jobs, support in work. And you know what they said? They found it was better for their mental health to have that structure, to have that purpose with the right support.
But what will
I think it's a challenge. But I am optimistic.
But what will you do about people who you believe can work but won't work? I mean, you are already, which might have slipped slightly under the radar, the government is already tightening up the rules on who can claim disability benefits. It's known as the Work Capability Assessment. Now, that is being changed, and the projections are that more than 400,000 people might lose out benefits. Now, disability groups have said, actually, all you're going to do then is land many, many, many people in poverty. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, we're actually going to be bringing forward our own reforms on sickness and disability benefits. That's what the Chancellor announced in the budget and the OBR has confirmed.
But you're not dropping that, just to be, but I want to be clear on this point. So you inherited changes to this particular set of rules.
And those savings will be made, but
right,
we will
so
be
you're going to
bringing
save the money,
our
which
own
means
reforms. And let me tell you why.
Just to be really clear, you are still planning to save the money here, and that means removing benefits from people.
We will deliver the savings, but this has got to be part of a proper package of reforms. And I want to be really careful here, because millions of people rely on those benefits. And many of them, whenever they hear this, are frightened and worried. And I don't blame them after the last 14 years. But firstly, our starting point is the belief in the equal rights and chances of disabled people and those with health problems to earn a living just like anybody else does. We need to transform those opportunities by breaking down the barriers into work, but that does mean we need to look at the system of benefits and reform or replace the work capability assessment, because it's not working. It's not working for the people who depend on it, and it's not working for the taxpayer.
But I just want to be really clear on what you will do, because the plans that you inherited from the former government would mean that more than 400,000 people would be denied maybe as much as £400 a month. You want to make that saving. You want to get the money out of the system.
We will deliver those savings, but we will bring forward our own reforms. You'll hear more about this when we launch our white paper on Tuesday.
But are you telling those people this morning they'll be able to keep their benefits or not? As you rightly say, people are worried about this.
I'm saying we will bring forward our own reforms. You wouldn't expect me to announce this on your programme, but my objective is that disabled people should have the same chances and rights to work as everybody else. They need more opportunities, and it needs to be underpinned by a system that actually supports people into work rather than writing them off.
For many people, this is about poverty, and it's about the fear of losing out. And one of this government's early decision was to take winter fuel payments away from all but the poorest pensioners. And one of those who's losing out, one of our viewers called Jenny, wants some advice. She wants us to ask you, I hear energy prices are rising again. Should I cut down on heating and put on a blanket?
The first thing I'd say to her is, see if you are entitled to pension credit. We've got over 800,000 pensioners missing out on up to £3,900 a year on pension credit, and also missing out on their winter fuel payment. There's also the £150 a warm homes discount, which is available not just to those on pension credit, but those just above. And there's also the Household Support Fund, which we have extended for another year with £1 billion, which can help the very poorest pensioners on pension credit, but those just above too.
But Secretary of State, she wants to know,
available.
should she turn her heating down? Should she put a blanket on?
I do not want anyone choosing between heating or eating. That is why we have made the biggest push to make sure the very poorest pensioners get the support they're entitled to. There's other support available too, and I think it's really important people know that.
Let's turn then to a huge and very sensitive subject of assisted dying. Now, MPs will be able to vote as they wish on Friday. There's also this separate draft legislation in the Scottish Parliament, but it will be a huge discussion this week in Westminster. Now, you back this change. Why?
Look, the government's position, and it's really important, I'm clear about this, is that it is a free vote. The government does not have a position of yes or no in this, but I have for many years supported this and indeed voted for it the last time, because I believe in giving people as much power, say and control as possible over the things that matter to them most. And I believe the bill has the right safeguards to make sure that that can be done properly. Now, you will, I'm sure, want to get into the debate about that bill, but let me just say this thing. I think it is really important as a society we talk about what makes for a good death, because thank goodness with medical advances the sudden deaths from heart attacks and stroke are much less common than they were in the past, and many of us in our own families see people who take more time to die. And we really need to wake up to that question and face it about what makes a good death. And that will be different for different people. For some, it will be having that good quality palliative care in a hospice or at home. And others, I believe, would want that right to choose assisted dying.
And that is a vital conversation. But in the context of this week and the safeguards in this bill, your colleague, the Health Secretary, your colleague, the Justice Secretary, who would preside over the legal framework, she's told her constituents that the proposed safeguards are not nearly enough. They are particularly weak, to use her phrase. How can you judge that the country is ready to do this if the minister who's in charge of the justice system says the safeguards aren't strong enough?
Well, you'll understand that as a government minister, I don't want to get into discussing all of the details about that, or, you know, Shabana and Wes have strong views.
This is so important. This is a profound
I understand
change.
that. The government's position is neutral, but let me say this. The bill's safeguards are that you have to be terminally ill with 6 months of life remaining, to have 2 independent doctors agree that you are of sound mind and that you haven't come under pressure, and a High Court judge. That's what's in the bill. People will debate that. I believe that those are the strong enough safeguards. Others will disagree.
But do you think that this is settled for the country? MPs have only had three weeks.
Let me just say,
I just want to ask you this question.
Yeah. No,
there are people on both sides of this debate who are not necessarily convinced that now is the time. They're not necessarily believing the conversation has taken place fully or widely enough. And the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who is against the change, we should say, but he's suggesting having some kind of more structured conversation, whether it might be a commission or citizens' assemblies, but so that as a country, politicians and the public could be really sure.
People are always going to disagree on this, Laura. They will always disagree on this. And the point is not that this is for everybody, is you have a right to, I think you should have the right to choose. Do you want to do this or not? Do you want good palliative care? I want all of these options, because that's what giving people power, choice and control means. It's not making you do my decision or my choice. It's about putting that in place. I actually think, I know this is being often I understand it, reduced to a sort of debate about who thinks what within cabinet. There's something much bigger here, which is as a country and a society, more of us will see death and have longer deaths, and we have to debate that. I think ultimately that is only a good thing, because death comes to us all.
But I'm not asking you about a cabinet split. I'm asking you now whether perhaps the right thing would be to have a pause so that people can have more time to think about this, to be really, really sure it's a profound change.
You will know that we have been debating this since the last time we voted on it in 2015. So I've no doubt that even if we did have that, there would be strongly differing opinions. That, Laura, is life.
OK, Liz Kendall, Welfare Secretary, it's great to have you with us in the studio this morning, especially on such important subjects this morning. Well, if MPs back the measure on Friday, it would be one of the most profound changes in a long time in England and Wales. There is that draft law in the Scottish Parliament too. And the proposed law would allow people over 18 to have help to end their own lives, but with conditions. As Liz Kendall was telling us, they must have less than 6 months to live, they must be able to administer a fatal drug themselves, and they must have agreement from 2 doctors and a High Court judge that they've made their own decision. And if it goes ahead, well, the UK would in a way be catching up with many other countries, including Belgium, which has some of the most liberal laws. It introduced euthanasia when it's administered by doctors back in 2002. And that's designed to help people living with unbearable suffering, to use their phrase, including those with mental illnesses. And since 2014, it includes children in some cases. Now they're considering making it easier for people with dementia to end their own lives too. Frank Vandenbroucke is the Belgian health minister, and I asked him how the issue had changed Belgium.
Well, there was a lot of debate about the law when it was introduced in 2002, but I think by now it's been very well accepted that euthanasia is something that is not an unconditional right, but there is a right to request euthanasia. Let's say 25 years ago, there was also a real divide maybe in along lines of religious belief versus people who do not hold their religious belief on dying and the right to die. But I think that's kind of changed very much.
What's also changed is the numbers of people. At the beginning, there were only a few hundred a year. Now it's more than 3,000. And since the law was brought in, it's also expanded, even including euthanasia for terminally ill children. Now, I think to a lot of people in this country, that might sound quite surprising. How can you justify that?
But let me first say something on the numbers. Over the last 10 years, the numbers have been between 2,000 and 3,000. And indeed, in 2023, the registered cases were 3,422 to be exact. And that's 3.1% of all deaths. So let's say 3% of deaths involve euthanasia. I don't think that is a very high number per se. It's only 3.1% of all deaths. When it's about minors, it's only about physical disorders, and the parents must agree, and it's extremely rare, I should say.
Much of the debate in this country right now is about the concept of a slippery slope. You would start off with very limited situations, but the law would expand over the years. Many people who are worried about that might look at what's happened in Belgium and think, actually, that's exactly what happened. You started off with very tight limits, and actually the law has expanded to include children, to include potentially now more people who suffer from dementia. Can you understand people's concerns when they look at what's happened?
I think it's a delicate issue. I think we should not tread lightly here. It's a very serious, delicate issue. But as a matter of fact, if you look into the actual trajectory of Belgian legislation, it's not been a slippery slope.
There are delicate arguments, though, as you said, and there have been controversies. And there were a pair of deaf twins, Mark and Eddie Verbessem. Now, they chose to end their lives after being told they would eventually go blind because they feared losing their independence. Now, what message did that send to people about disabilities and the rights of people with disabilities to lead full lives?
Not at all. The judgment that was made was that for these two people, their prospects created an unbearable suffering. You are deaf, mute, you will go blind, you lose everything, and so it was seen as an unbearable suffering. Obviously, that's an assessment, but I think if you go through that case, it's not someone who, it were not people who were tired of life.
For our MPs who are voting on this in Parliament this week to change the law in England and Wales, it is a very difficult decision for many of them.
Yes,
As
I understand.
a fellow politician on the other side of the channel, what advice would you give to them? What should they have in their minds, having been through it in your country?
When I look at what's tabled in your parliament at this very moment, it's a very, very strict procedure. It's stricter than the Belgian procedure because it involves always a judge in any case. It's also different because in the proposal that is tabled in your parliament, it's the patient, his or herself, who has to take this lethal doses. But I would say really both in the Netherlands and Belgium, it's not the case that you have a kind of a continuously changing legislation, continuously widening the possibilities and shifting, let's say, to nowhere. That's not the case.
Minister, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. We're very grateful to you for your time.
Pleasure.
Well, the perspective from Belgium, a country that made a similar change some years ago now. You've been sharing also your deeply personal views on this subject. Liz, who's a retired GP and hospice doctor, complains that supporters suggest there's only two alternatives: a dignified and clean assisted death or an undignified, painful, messy, natural one. Liz says this is simply untrue. Most natural deaths are quiet and dignified, especially where there's high quality palliative care. But on the other hand, Mary, who is 78, says if individuals feel strongly they do not want to cost the NHS, that is as valid as people deciding to join the army knowing they may be killed in war. Please put autonomy at the centre of the debate. And Anne says parliamentary debate by first past the post politicians is all very well, but on a matter as important as this, I believe the wishes of the whole population should be sought by a referendum. Well, you three, this is a huge question of morality, of ethics, and people are trying to keep the politics out of it, and you've all got your own experiences. Nadine, tell us your story and how it shaped your views.
Well, can I just say, first of all, about Liz's contribution, which she very passionately believes in people having the right to choose. But not everybody has a family or whose next of kin is the family or friends. For many people, the next of kin is the state. And that number in this country is a large number of people, and that concerns me. But my own story is my husband was diagnosed with stage 4 bowel cancer and given 4 months to live. And the very first thing he wanted to do was contact Dignitas. In fact, we had an argument within hours of his diagnosis because he was Googling Dignitas and absolutely angrily determined. Because in his mind, he said, I don't want to have a painful death. I've only got 4 months. I've got to sort this now. What happened was my daughters and I, we all of us for 4 months nursed him at home together with amazing support from the community nurses. He ended up on a morphine syringe driver, and before he passed, quietly, without any pain, he said, this has been the best 4 months of my life because we had such a wonderful time. And there was lots of laughter and lots of good times. And he completely changed his mind when he came to the point of dying about having ever wanted to have gone to, as he couldn't, you have to sign up for Dignitas a long time before, but he was absolutely determined. And if somebody had given him the option and those first days and said to him, yes, you can do this, I think he would have done it. It was only by the fact that he realised by a gentle persuasion and by a lot of love surrounding him that there is another way, and he went so peacefully that we are forever grateful that he changed his mind on that.
Jonathan, now your brother had a very different situation, and what's your family's experience?
My brother suffered from motor neuron disease. He had been a very active, very successful sculptor, very strong. And he died earlier this year. And he had not made up his mind whether he would, if he had the right, have exercised the right to an assisted death. He strongly believed, and had believed for a long time, that you should have that right. For myself, I've believed it. I've been involved at the margins and interested for some 30 years. And what I would like to address, if I may, are two things. One is the slippery slope argument. The Belgium example is one example. If you look to Oregon, which has the legislation that is most clearly like ours, it's not as fiercely safeguarded, not quite. There, it's been enforced for 27 years, and the law has not changed in any way. That's the fundamental argument. The second thing on slippery slope, you can only change the law if it's the will of Parliament to change the law. You don't change the law, it's not executive fiat, so it has to be by process. So I think the slippery slope argument, I understand why strongly people feel about it who are opposed. People who've got disabilities, I strongly understand that. I mean, this is a hugely horrible issue to have to deal with. We like to shy away from death in any case. The other issue which comes up again and again is the question of coercion. You can never rule out the fact that bad people might try to persuade someone to die. In the law, and don't forget, as this law, as it goes through in the law, if you do that within the last 6 months of someone's life and are found to do it, then you end up with up to 14 years in jail.
And that's the point, though, that faith leaders have been making today. There's a group of them who've come together to publish a letter talking about the risk of coercion, and essentially they're just not satisfied that it could be removed as a risk. I mean, Piers, what do you think of this debate? And I think, unusually perhaps for you, you're not that sure, really.
I've been round the houses with it, which I think a lot of people may have done. And normally I feel very certain about almost everything. On this one, I've changed my mind quite a lot. And even listening to the two co-panelists here, I can absolutely understand both arguments. You know, I've had a recent experience with one of my closest friends who died from glioblastoma, which is a very aggressive, incurable brain cancer. So I was able to see at first hand somebody go through an awful year. But it was interesting. I had a conversation with him about Dignitas. You know, how did he feel? And he said, you know, I understand why people may take that option, but he also had in his last few months some extremely powerful, poignant, moving, emotional times of the type you described, with his wife, who was an unbelievable carer for him, with his son, with his mates. You know, he had just special times that he would never have had. And I've sort of come around, really, I don't say I vehemently disagree with you, Jonathan, because I don't. I get why, if you're in extreme pain at the end of your life, of course you would want to have relief from it.
I don't think it's just extreme pain. It's one, and you know, Nadine's story is extremely moving.
Yeah.
And of course it's the case that pain can very often be controlled. What can't be controlled is the loss of autonomy in someone who is close to death. Losing bodily function, needing someone else to look after you, desperate not to have to go on enduring the humiliation.
But what about the other side of this, which I think is, you know, my friend had hope right to the end. He had hope, even though his condition was incurable. Hope that maybe artificial intelligence might suddenly discover a cure for glioblastoma. And I think that can't be ruled out. And I would also say what's really important in this debate is palliative care and hospices. Because he died in a hospice at the end, very peacefully, pretty well pain-free, because they were able to manage the end of his life like that. And I just think, I didn't realise, I'm a patron of a hospice in Sussex, St Peter and St James. They told me how chronically underfunded they are by government. I mean, most of the funding is done by these hospices. We should be putting more money and funding into helping hospices give people a peaceful form of assisted death.
That's West Streeting's point. So Shabana Mahood, her point of the legal framework from her perspective as the Justice Secretary is absolutely vital. She, as the Justice Secretary, does not think that it's fit for purpose, but West Streeting will be the person responsible for the operational delivery of such a policy. And he doesn't think that it's right and that we should be putting more money into hospices and into palliative care.
And yet, Nadine, if somebody has lost hope, if they want at the end of their life to have their final decision respected, and it feels like that to them, respect their final decision, that point about autonomy that Jonathan made, ought they not to have that choice?
But I understand that, but you know, at the moment I think it's less than 200 people a year take that option. And I think that it's you're making a lot of people vulnerable, disabled people, people in care homes. Those people who are sat in care homes now who feel protected with the arm of the state around their shoulders, knowing they are protected, who will feel incredibly vulnerable the moment this passes into law.
Jonathan.
Will that number increase? Will it stay at 200? Should we put those people, make those people more vulnerable for 200 people?
Nadine was making two important points. The key thing is that, in my view, there should be no competition between a palliative care that's improved. I've been in hospital, I've seen people die in hospital, I've got friends who've died, and it sometimes works very well, and that's what they want. In the other cases, it doesn't work like that. It happens to my brother. There was no possibility of recovery.
I had a cousin with motor neuron disease
you know that,
who went through a horrendous time.
And the other important thing is that when someone is close to death and wants to die, this is a 6-month period. In that period, they often, those who've gone to Dignitas, and you know, it's right, Dignitas is very few, have to decide what to do. Now, some of those, of the 5,500 people who commit suicide each year, take their own lives in circumstances which can be very nasty, very painful for everyone involved. We don't even know whether there's coercion involved. There can well be. To legalise the framework in ways that girdle it around with safeguards. And one more thing only on this. It goes through this process. 2 doctors, one after the other, timed gap. Then to a judge, time gap. And the judge can ask anyone to check that he wishes to check for himself or herself that they are not being subjected to coercion.
Would they?
I have to trust this country's governance. I like to trust its governance. I like to trust the law.
I think it's a misplaced trust to trust the state with people's lives. I think it's a misplaced trust. I don't trust the state in doing a lot of things.
We trust the state all the time. The NHS
well, if the Justice Secretary says that the law is not fit for purpose, I don't think we can trust it.
Well, I don't think.
And who are these doctors, by the way? Because how many people now have a really close relationship with their own doctors? How well do they know people? Right? And what about the issue of abuse? You know, we know that several million pensioners in this country already get abused by family members. What happens if they start to put unbearable pressure on them to ease the burden, or who want to have a money grab?
I feel we could have a conversation with you three for our whole hour
one very brief point, if I may.
Briefly, Jonathan, if you could.
I would make it very, very briefly. The hospice care service in this country is neutral. I have spoken to hospice care senior nurses running hospices in Australia and also in Oregon, who were opposed initially, support it because they can run together the care of the dying, and then if the patient wishes it,
Jonathan,
they can have
It's called the Liverpool Care Pathway in the UK. There is a way to do that.
Okay, well, all three of you, I'm
Very
afraid we must move on, but it's hugely complicated and hugely sensitive, and as we've heard from all three of you, everybody's shaped also by their own experience with their own friends and family, and we're grateful to you for sharing not just your views, but your personal experiences, and also grateful to you two for sharing your stories. Remember, you can always get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk is the email, or if you're social media minded, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay, and the WhatsApp number is there for you on the screen. And we might have some more of your views later in the programme or in our newsletter every Thursday. Now, as we've been discussing, when it comes to the vote on Friday, it's important to remember MPs won't split neatly down party lines. They'll be able to vote as they wish, a free vote. And inside each party, there isn't an established consensus either. The Prime Minister has tried to keep the Cabinet out of it without that much success, but individual politicians have been giving their views, as we heard from Liz Kendall earlier. Well, Kevin Hollinrake, the Shadow Housing Secretary for the Conservatives, and it's good to have you with us in the studio. Now, you have said that you do support assisted dying after you saw what your mother went through in the last moments of her life. Do you think the bill that will become before MPs this week is the right one?
Yes, I do. And I actually voted for assisted dying back in 2015, before my mum passed away. I thought it was the right thing that people have their choice. And this isn't the state having that choice, it's individuals. And I'm going to say people already have that choice, because many people take their own lives, of course. About 600 people a year who are terminally ill. And when I think about the future and think about my own children, I wouldn't want my children to have to say, Dad committed suicide. You know, I would want them for me to have that choice and them to be comfortable with that choice. But I think these are the right checks and balances. There's 2 doctors plus the High Courts. The provisions are similar to other jurisdictions, such as Oregon, as Jonathan was saying, that have not gone down this slippery slope as some people were worried about. I'm worried about that too, but I think the checks and balances are there.
But is it realistic to think that the safeguards are enough when the woman who's in charge of the justice system, the Justice Secretary, says that they're particularly weak?
Well, that's her view, and
but she's the Justice Secretary. It's not just
there are many
any
lawyers in the two lawyers in a discussion, and they rarely agree. So there are lots of lawyers who also know the justice system are comfortable with these provisions. I think it's important that everybody has their view, whatever their role is, and whether it's your Health Secretary or Justice Secretary. But that's just a view of a member of Parliament. I think it's very important we all listen to those views, and I listen very carefully to all the 3 views just expressed on your panel. But I still have the same mind. I think I would like that choice. I want other people to have that choice. And I don't think it's the right for the state to prevent them having that choice.
Do you feel, though, that actually it is the settled will of the country? You know, MPs have only had a couple of weeks to debate it. There are suggestions that there could be a commission or citizens' assemblies or something like that, in order that everybody in the country, you know, everybody watching, everybody listening, really feels that this is an issue that's been properly considered. Do you feel it has been?
I think it has. We've been debating this for, say, 2015, and listened to all the debates that day, and many debates since we've been involved in Parliament. So I think there has been a good discussion on this, a good debate on this. It's important that debate continues on Friday when we discuss it. But if you ask the public, if people express a view, about 80% of the public say they would like this choice. And I don't want to deprive them of that choice.
We've heard, though, from Belgium today, where it has been expanded to include a small number of children in some circumstances, people with mental illness, and they're looking at expanding the numbers of dementia patients who could do this. Isn't the concern about a slippery slope when you look at an example like that and see how it's expanded? Well,
Belgium had different rules to start with. They looked at this unbearable suffering, which isn't what's been proposed here. This is about people with terminal illness. And this is very similar to other jurisdictions, including Oregon, who was said before. But all those jurisdictions have used this only for terminal illness, have not expanded those categories. So I'm comfortable that Parliament will make sure we make the right decisions on this, and that we will keep those decisions under review. I think in the legislation, I think after 5 years we review the provisions and see how it's working. But I think that the right checks and balances are there in this legislation.
OK, well, it will be interesting to see what happens on Friday. And if it passes on Friday, that's not a sudden change. That's just the beginning of a long legal process to actually put it into law. Let's talk about welfare then. Now, the numbers went sky high on the Conservatives' watch. Are you going to back Labour's plans to try and get the numbers down? Yeah,
if the plans are right. I haven't seen them in detail yet. But yeah, there's no doubt that this phenomenon has grown rapidly, particularly since the pandemic. We are seeing a number of people leaving the place of work because of mental illness, a huge rise. So, and that's a huge cost for the taxpayer, of course. So we had plans in place, I think you referred to them earlier in your interview with Liz Kendall, that would have reduced that number by 400,000, saving the taxpayer an awful lot of money. It's not just about saving money, it's also about getting people into work. You know, most of us feel our mental health is better when we're at work. So, but there are incentives in the system to leave the place of work to go on cash benefits. And that's one of the things I've been looking for in these changes Labour are going to make. Are they going to make that difficult decision to reduce cash benefits? Because that currently incentivises people to leave the place of work.
So after the end of 14 years in charge, you made it easier for people sometimes to take the cash and stay at home than go out to work.
But certainly, we didn't make it easier. What happened was that the pandemic, there's a new phenomenon as a result of the pandemic. That's the big rise we saw. About 800,000-900,000 people added to the number of people on long-term sickness. About 40% of them through mental health. That we were dealing with that. The provisions we brought forward on the work capability assessment was a starting point of that, and that will prove effective, as you referred to earlier. But there's more we should do. I welcome the fact Labour are looking at this. I want to make sure they do the right things rather than just talk a good game. It's the actions that count.
But what do you think actually went wrong? Do you think that there are people out there who's essentially taking the taxpayer for a ride, or did something sort of fundamental break in the country during the pandemic when people got used to being at home? What do you think happened?
Well, I say, you show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. At times, of course, people are going to choose a route not to work if you can provide other kind of benefits where they're not going to be any worse off. That was probably the wrong thing in terms of mental health. So I'm not saying everybody with mental health can work, not at all, but some people can. And if you can work, you should work. That's the principle. So it was a phenomenon caused largely by the pandemic. We're dealing with that. We were dealing with it already. There's more we need to do. It's really important Labour do deal with it.
Well, we should point out also the changes to those 400,000 people are about disability benefits. That's the change that you had outlined that Labour is going to continue with in some form or another.
But there are personal independence payments for people with mental health. That's the key thing here. So in many ways, you can leave the place of work and not be any worse off. That can't be the right thing if you can work.
OK, well, Kevin Hollinrake, we must leave it there, but do come back and we'll talk about your brief of housing, a huge subject of interest to our viewers, so come back and we'll talk to you about that another time. Thanks very much indeed for being with us today. Now then, a busy news week with Donald Trump on his way back to the White House and the winter coming. In the words of one government source, it is crunch time for the conflict in Ukraine. This week, Ukraine fired US and British-made missiles into Russia for the first time. And Russia fired a new hypersonic ballistic missile into the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. Vladimir Putin has been busy ramping up his threatening rhetoric too. But what next for the West? Well, the French Foreign Secretary was in London meeting David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, this week. Could French long-range missiles soon be fired from Ukraine into Russia too?
President Macron last May expressed the idea that according to international law and in a logic of self-defense, the Ukrainians could use long-range missiles to hit targets in the Russian territory from where the Russians are aggressing Ukraine.
Could relentlessly fighting Putin, to use your and David Lammy's phrase, mean expanding the mission of our militaries?
That's what we're doing right now. We are convinced that we need to keep supporting Ukraine to allow the Ukrainians, when they consider that the time has come, to enter peace negotiation in a position of strength. This is the reason why we keep training and equipping the Ukrainian soldiers. A full brigade was trained in France over the past few months. It's in the process of going back to Ukraine and be able to fight on the front line.
President Macron previously didn't rule out putting troops on the ground. So can you see a day when French troops might be deployed in Ukraine?
What President Macron said is that we should not set and express red lines. We should set a strategic ambiguity and not say what we ought or what we ought not to do. And this is the reason why we do not discard any option publicly. And again, in close cooperation with our allies, with the UK, with the Europeans, with the US, and with the Ukrainians, we decide on what strategies to undertake.
Is everything, though, potentially on the table?
We will support Ukraine as intensely and as long as necessary. Why? Because it is our security that is at stake. Each time the Russian army progresses by 1 square kilometer, the threat gets 1 square kilometer closer to Europe. Our security is at stake, and that's why we stand alongside the Ukrainians.
What about accelerating Ukraine's entry to NATO? One of the things President Zelensky's victory plan has in it is an immediate invitation. How enthusiastically would you support Ukraine joining NATO?
Well, we've expressed our openness on the principle of extending an invitation to Ukraine and more broadly, Euro-Atlantic integration. And that means NATO invitation. That also means EU accession.
You say you have expressed an openness to it, but given the new dangers, do you think it is something that should be accelerated?
This is a discussion that we're having with other NATO countries to get them to sort of get closer to our position.
So you are enthusiastically arguing for this, are you, to allies, saying get on with it?
Well, we are open to extending an invitation. And so in our discussions with friends and allies of Ukraine, we are working to get them closer to our positions.
With reports of Putin firing an intercontinental ballistic missile and Ukraine's use of US and UK long-range missiles, do you feel that we are in a new moment, a new, more dangerous moment in this war?
Well, it's yet another escalatory move by Vladimir Putin, who violated international law many times, who deported children from Ukraine to the point that he's now subject of an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court, who more recently exported his war of aggression to Asia by resorting to North Korean soldiers in his war of aggression against Ukraine, and who even more recently updated his nuclear doctrine. The firing of intercontinental missile is in the same order of actions, an action that is meant to intimidate, to create fear and agitation. We will not let ourselves be intimidated by Vladimir Putin.
At the beginning of our conversation, you said you wanted Ukraine to be in a strong enough position in order to enter peace talks. How does this end? Because many conflicts have to end around the negotiating table. But at the moment, President Zelensky says he will not compromise. He won't give up an inch of territory. Might he have to compromise?
I believe that up until the Ukrainians decide that the moment has come for peace, our only responsibility is to support them as much as possible, to give them the strongest possible hand. Europe will have to stand up in order to ensure and bear its own security in a world that will not look like the world we knew before the start of this war of aggression. This means stronger cooperation throughout or across the European continent, and that's also one of the reasons why I was today in London to meet with David Lammy.
Do you think every country in Europe, France and Britain included, will have to pay more of their national income to defence, given the world we live in now?
Given the world we live in, we'll have to do more in terms of defense. Of course, we'll have to spend more if we want to do more. And I think that we have to face those new challenges.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the International Criminal Court. If Benjamin Netanyahu landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, would the French authorities arrest him?
This decision by the International Criminal Court is the formalization of an accusation. It is by no means a judgment. We are committed to international justice. We also say that we've condemned in strongest possible terms the fact that humanitarian help has not been able to reach civil populations in Gaza, where the situation is catastrophic. But in no way do we draw any form of equivalence between the Hamas leaders that have been targeted by the ICC and the government of Israel. We should not do politics with justice, and I will oppose those in my country that will try and use these decisions by the International Criminal Court as fuel for their political campaigns, so to speak.
And if I may, final question. The Prime Minister here and his team talk all the time about a reset with our European neighbours. What does that mean to you? Because as a concept, I'm not sure that our viewers really know what our government means by it. What does it mean to you?
Well, I'm the first French foreign minister to visit London in 6 years. So I think that a reset is warranted, and it is more than welcome. We have this shared view about what the future of global governance should be. And in these times where brute force seems to be the way that a number of countries want to govern the world, we need to have an alternative view, which is the view of dialogue, negotiation, of collective solutions to the challenges of our times.
Minister, thank you so much for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much.
And of course, all these diplomatic conversations are taking place in the context of Trump being on the way back to the White House. Now, it appears you're recently back, having spent 2 weeks in New York during this period of massive political transformation in the States. What do you think President Trump is going to do about Ukraine?
Probably surprise people, like he normally does. I know he's seen President Zelensky in person, and Zelensky didn't come away and say anything negative about that conversation. So whatever was discussed, he clearly wasn't anti the conversation thread. No, I think that Trump's a deal maker at his heart. That's really his great raison d'etre as a politician. It's what he's really good at. And I don't think he's going to come in back to the White House with a legacy now to make for himself, where the first action he did is give a Russian dictator a clear win in a war in Europe. I just can't see that happening. I think it's inevitable now, sadly, that Ukraine will have to do some form of deal over the land that Putin has stolen. But I think that Trump will try and bring this to an end, as he will with the Israel-Hamas war as well. You know, Trump, I've had this conversation with him, he just thinks wars are bad business. He's a business guy. He thinks they're incredibly expensive. A lot of people get killed. And often when you look at the end game and what comes out of these things, well, what have people really achieved? So I think he will surprise people. And I know that, again, Elon Musk is a pivotal figure in this. He's had a lot of interaction with both Russia and with Ukraine using his Starlink satellites. So I think there's a lot going on there that we don't really at the moment know, but is going to come clear.
And Jonathan, I think you've travelled a lot in Russia and Ukraine, and from a sort of historical perspective, where do you think this ends up? Does it end up inevitably in some kind of negotiation and some concession on the Ukrainian side?
I'm not a fan, understatement, of Donald Trump. However, I have a glimmer of hope about Ukraine in respect of what Trump might be able to do. We are talking very often a nonsensical language about victory. I hear our politicians saying all the time, Trump has got that Putin's got to lose. We have got to, the West has got to win. The Russians will not give up. In my last book, I was looking at the Russians in Ukraine in 1944. They will not give up Crimea under any other circumstances. NATO will not allow an escalation. Pace, what the French foreign minister says, by authorizing NATO weapons directly to be used, human beings, inside Russia. It's inconceivable. NATO is very unlikely to allow Ukraine to join NATO for a very long time. There has to be a least worst case deal. It's unbearably awful. Putin's a bad man, but some kind of armistice line. I believe this actually for a long time. I notice more and more people are sort of saying the same kind of thing. An armistice line in the Donetsk region, that there will be some either side neutral, rather like North-South Korea, you know, and that will hold the line. Ukraine can't sustain this. Young Ukrainians don't want to go on fighting. And there's reality check we need.
And Nadine, for the British government, though, which has been so, on both iterations, has been so supportive of Ukraine, how do they make a kind of public pivot, I suppose, to say, yes, you have to move to negotiation, if that's what they think?
Well, that pivot has to happen with Zelensky's support. I don't think it can happen without it. I think we're in a situation where we may see Donald Trump as saving the world because, you know, if he's going to end, if he's serious, and, you know, I don't doubt a word Piers has said in bringing an end and a pragmatic resolution to this war, and with Israel and Hamas, then that's going to change our entire global political landscape.
It's a pretty big entry. I mean, Piers, just briefly, Trump 2.0 compared to Trump 1.0, what's your prediction?
Kind of fascinating. I mean, I thought that he would win pretty much most of the year, but particularly after he got shot. I think that image of Trump punching the air, saying fight, 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 really resonated with Americans. But no, he won because of the cost of living crisis. People trusted him more to fix that. He won because of the illegal immigration crisis on the border. Nearly 10 million people came in illegally within the 4 years of the Biden administration. But he also won because of what he called a core of common sense. And it really came down, the most effective ad that he did in the whole campaign was one that said, Kamala's for they, them, Trump is for you. He took on the whole kind of trans debate. He took on the personal pronoun debate. He took on what Elon, his mate, calls the woke mind virus. And you know what? Americans in large numbers went to the ballot box and they voted for Trump, not the woke candidate.
You'll never see Labour run with that campaign ad in the next election, by the way.
Okay, well,
but you might see others do it against them.
Well, we have to wrap
They don't run with such a campaign ad.
We have to wrap it up. Thank you all for your common sense coming from different perspectives this morning. It's been great to have you with us. Thank you, of course, most of all to you for watching at home. Just a few days before a vote that could usher in one of the biggest social changes in years, talking about whether or not to introduce assisted dying. Would it be progress or peril? MPs will decide on Friday. Thank you so much also for sharing your deeply personal stories with us today. I'll be on Sunday's newscast with Paddy O'Connell on BBC Sounds a bit later. Victoria will be here next week, not me, but I'll look forward very much to seeing you again on Sunday, the 8th of December, same time, same place. Goodbye.